Okay, welcome everybody. Nice to see all your smiling faces and in anticipation of what we're going to talk about. What are we going to talk about? Who am I? Why am I in this room? What's going on here? Oh, okay, no, a little bleed through of another reality there. Okay, welcome all. I'm going to take you through a journey through time and space. I'm going to take you through a journey through your own mind and the collective mind of the human race. Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? Well, we're going to answer that tomorrow. Okay? But to begin, I'm going to pose a question that I know everybody in this room and probably most people watching this video have asked either at least once or probably 10,000 times in the course of your life. What is it all about? Why are we here? How did we get here? How does it all fit together? And how do a very small number of individuals and small groups control billions of people and an entire planet? And who is behind it all? And who is the puppet master and who's pulling the strings? Anybody here not interested in that question? Okay, because if it's not of interest to you, there's a baby shower over there you could go attend. And I know it's tempting, some beautiful young ladies there, but this might be more interesting. Okay, well that's the question that I have been asking myself for most of my 57 years. What I usually do when I start a presentation like this is I give a very brief summary about myself, which basically starts by saying that at a very young age, I had a sense of the world around me, the people who constituted, for the most part, that world. And it began raising a question in my mind: why is this place so screwed up? Why is it upside down and inside out? And what is behind it? How does it work? How does it come together? How is it put together? Because I sense at a very early age, this is distinctly not right. Okay, anybody relate to that position? Okay, we have a unanimous, for those who can't see from the camera's view, a unanimous raising of the hands. Something is distinctly not right in this reality that we're in. It is upside down, inside out, and ass backwards. Right? So I had a sense of that, 3, 4, 5 years old. I certainly didn't put it in those kind of terms and words, but I definitely had a sense of that before I was 7 years old. And I essentially set out, I didn't necessarily put it in these terms, but I know that I had that in me at that time, set out that I'm going to crack the code, solve the puzzle, put it together, and figure out how it is, that question, how do a small number of people control this whole reality, and why are we self-destructing in this reality to fulfill an agenda? Now, of course, I didn't have those terms, terminology, or context. I just had a sort of, in today's language, a quantum sense of that. So basically, that's what I set my life to do, is set out to put the pieces together. Today, some people, because a year ago I started being on a internet radio show called Waking Up in America, and Val, who's the host of the show, asked me, well, how should I refer to you? And I said, well, she wanted a moniker or something. I said, well, call me the Master Puzzler. And she said, fine. So now I am known in some circles as the Master Puzzler. Why did I choose that? Because one of my most favorite things when I was a young person was to put jigsaw puzzles together. And I did it constantly, and I played games in my head. I was in these world championship puzzle tournaments, and I was putting them together in competition, and how fast can I do it, and how could I organize to get the speed and all of that. And I developed systems of how puzzles worked. You know, there's multi-levels or layers of how a jigsaw puzzle is put together. There's the whole picture. Like if this were a puzzle, here's the picture and it's on the box. So this is your goal, put the whole picture together. But when you break it down into all the pieces, you're looking at what are the shapes of the pieces? What are the patterns of those shapes? How do they categorize into different pattern shapes so that you can put the innies and the outies over here? You know how puzzles work, you know, an innie and an outie, and you know, each piece is basically square, but then there's anomaly pieces, and each relatively square piece with 4 sides either has 4 outies, 4 innies, or some number combination, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have the layers of the picture itself, you know, the nuances of shape and color in the picture. So you're looking at, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 layers of a puzzle and how it puts together. So of course I didn't realize it at the time, but I now know, looking back, that I was training my mind to seek out pieces of a puzzle and learn how to look at seemingly fragmented, disparate pieces spread out over a table, or spread out over time and space, spread out over a globe, a world that we exist in, and put them together. Okay, and there's a few clues that I've picked up along the way of how to do that. And I'm going to share all of that, and I'm going to share basically what conclusion I have come to after about 50 plus, a little over 50 years of seeking out the pieces. And I woke up this morning and I thought of that song that we heard in the 60s or 70s, you know, I am the seeker, you know, seeking high and low. Well, that's I'm sure how we all are, right? Nobody in this room is not a seeker. Seeker of the truth, seeker to put the pieces together and know how it all fits together. But in my exploration, I learned some things about how those who put it together, or how those who control it, do what they do behind the scenes. And one of the things is all the pieces are available. Okay, there is nothing hidden. It's hidden in plain sight, is really the phrase. And there's a reason for that. We're going to get into that reason as we go along. So I'm going to start by drawing a few very simple things on the whiteboard. The interesting thing about how does it all fit together, we live obviously in an extremely complex world in reality. You can take one subject, study it for many lifetimes and not necessarily plummet the entirety of that subject. But in order to know how this entire thing is put together and control is organized and structured, and where the solutions are behind that organization and structure, because that's one of the elements of how I've approached this. Not to belabor and harp on the problem, the issue, or who is controlling us, and they and them, and if it was only, you know, if we could only get rid of they or them, then it would all go away. Well, guess what? That is definitely not the case. We cannot get rid of they because they are we. Okay? We're in it together, and I'm going to show you how that is during the course of this 2 days. But you cannot control an extremely complex, multi-layered, multifaceted reality by complexity. It has to be very simple. Okay? So let's start with this. That's how the whole thing is done.
Wow, thank you. That clears up everything.
Okay? Shall we break for lunch? Was it worth it? It's true. Does anybody know how to figure that one out? Any guesses? Okay. So I stumped you to begin with. let's go back a few thousand years, 5, 6, 7,000 years. There was knowledge of how things worked back then, as there was knowledge going back 10,000 and many tens of thousands of years. We all know about Atlantis and Lemuria and all of that. We all know that there was a collapse of that civilization, structure, what have you. Who here would find it a surprise if I said Atlantis was not a place like in the Mediterranean or in the Atlantic, but it was a global structure? Everybody have already come to that already? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, Atlantis was as fully developed as an or as a civilization, for lack of a better term, as not necessarily as complete as we see today with billions of people, but it was a global civilization. Okay, it began collapsing, as we would consider that, let's just say around 12, 13,000 years ago. The so-called, fall into the ocean was not so much a collapse into the ocean as a rising of the ocean and a destruction of the lands that were occupied around the world. Something happened about 12, 13,000 years ago, which began that cycle. Science says that, the ice age that ended around that time suddenly started disappearing. The ice started retreating. Well, there's a number of factors, but one of the principal ones in what I've looked at is that the area that we know as Indonesia, Krakatoa, which is the largest deep water trench and of course one of the most volatile volcanic areas and so forth, exploded at a level beyond anything we've seen in recorded or even far-reaching history of the last 5,000 years. And it did cover the entire atmosphere with years of ash that then basically settled down on all of the ice. And when ash goes onto ice, it starts retaining heat more than it did before. And that's really what started the rise of the oceans. And the oceans rose about, somewhere between 300 and 500 feet. So this entire area over here, which was a major part of the Atlantean global civilization, all of these islands, the Philippines has about 10,000 islands. Indonesia has about 17,000 and everything in between. This was all one landmass. I mean, it's obvious if you think that 300 feet of ocean rose at that time. Okay, imagine 300 feet of ocean going down. Then you have mountains, you have valleys, you have a contiguous landmass. Okay, and a lot of other areas that the same thing. So there were remnants after that took place, and it's not, what I've always noticed, we look at how we see things, how we've been trained to see things. We see them in the Hollywood movie segments, The issue starts in the beginning phase of the movie. It gets all resolved in 100 or 120 minutes. We're looking for that, Hollywood moment where it happens instantaneously. Whatever it is, the apocalypse, the rapture, the fall of Atlantis. We think it happens in one day or happened in one day. No, it's over a long period of time. So the knowledgeable levels of the Atlantean civilization did move to certain areas and retain that knowledge. One of the key areas was right here in the British Isles. So let's just say about 10,000 years ago, we have a post-Atlantean civilization that retained the scientific knowledge of this area. Now, if you look at the Judeo-Christian system of thought that we're going to get into quite extensively, it says that it all started right around here and moved west. Okay, but when you take the blinders off and you do the proper research, you see that it really started here and moved east. But certain things intruded into that, which we're going to get into quite extensively, and basically turned it upside down and inside out and started concocting a story that our entire reality right now is built upon to justify and support the Judeo-Christian Western context or construct of how the Matrix has been created and how billions of people have bought into that. So hold that thought for a moment. I'm going to return to this. The basis of science and priesthood is knowledge. Okay. What was the essential framework of the knowledge that was retained at that time period that I'm talking about? It was the knowledge of our relationship in time and space. Where we sit and stand on a planet, the relationship of that planet as a spherical body, the relationship of that spherical body as part of a system that orbits around a central point we call the sun. The cycles of time, the daily cycle of the rotation, the annual cycle of the orbit, cycles of the seasons, all that kind of stuff. Natural order of time and space. Okay, that's basically what this is. Okay, as a starting point, but I'm not going to get into that yet. Let's talk about science and priesthood. Because as we know today, what used to be magic or mysticism or, whatever word we want to call it, in the past is just known science today. It's anything such as, the gods must be crazy if you've seen that movie, the bottle falls down from an airplane and that's a sign from the gods, or what have you. We know all about those stories in archaeology and paleontology and so forth of so-called, native or indigenous peoples who have no relationship to science. To them, it's magic, it's mysticism, it's spiritual, or what have you. So let's just say during the fall of civilization 10, 12,000 years ago, the retention of knowledge was held in a scientific priesthood type community, and the majority of the re-emerging population was basically in a level of ignorance and lack of understanding of their relationship in time and space on a planetary body with orbital systems around a solar system or a sun and all the rest of it. The daily cycle of the sun starting in the east, rising in the sky, making an arch, and setting in the west. Okay? The annual cycle of what we call the equinoxes and the solstices, of those cardinal points every 90 or so days, where on the horizon of the east, 2 times of the year, there's a vernal equinox and a autumnal equinox, spring and fall, that on the daily cycle, the annual cycle of the orbit around the sun stops, which is the literal translation of the word solstice, sol for sun, stis for stopping. The solstice in June and December stops at its maximum. If we chart every day, the sun will start moving to the solstice in the fall and or this way in the spring. And obviously opposites according to where you are in the southern or northern hemisphere. And twice a year it will end up here on the horizon. This was vitally important because the process of the seasons, planting, harvesting, knowing all of these things, including everything from the eclipse cycles to, I'm sure most of you have studied, the Mayan culture and the Peruvian and the Neolithic in Europe and all the rest of it. And it was all based on solar and lunar cycles and planetary cycles and time-space cycles. Okay. To us, it's a natural thing. We know this very readily in scientific, mathematical, structural components. Back then, the reality was the priests knew it. The priests were the scientists. Okay? And they retained that knowledge and progressively instituted systems of control.
That's true.
Right. Okay. But that's true mostly the last 5,000 years. Prior to that, based on certain individuals' research and study, removing the veils and the illusions, the fact is that there were colleges, if you will, and systems of disseminating the knowledge that was retained and disseminated out primarily in this area, and to some extent in, several areas over here. But I'm going to focus for now on this area. So I can use I just bought my pointer.
Oh, it works.
Can everybody see that? Okay, good. Actually, it works pretty good for me to do this, but I want to use my new pointer. Now, this would be a magic tool that the priests would use, amongst the indigenous. Say, look, I can make a red dot. That is your God. You laugh because you know it's true. Okay. Well, it's not very much different today. There's just a little, gloss of pseudoscience in the education of the masses that, they accept what is, but it's still magic to them. But the specific man who I read over the last few years that started really adding very important elements to what I was putting together and putting this whole puzzle together, that for those of you who are interested in further research and reading, his name is Michael Tsarian. I'll spell it. Anybody heard of his name? Okay. Paul has. Michael Tsarion. And if you do a Google on his name, you can pull up his website, and he sells his books. A really important book to read is called The Irish Origins of Civilization.
I have read some of that book.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to integrate some of that. I'm going to integrate some of Vivian's friend, Jordan Maxwell, and many others. And that's what I've done. I've in my 50 plus years of seeking all the puzzle pieces, I have a type of mind that I can retain a lot. And more importantly, I came to understand that I'm what I call a synergist or a synthesis, one who synthesizes, because these are all fragmentary pieces. And I've really assiduously worked with myself to not get stuck in any one category of thinking, which is very important. There's valuable pieces in everything. And so I have studied as much as I could in many, many categories. What I've done, and I will read, or in the past I don't read many books anymore, but I would read a whole book just to get two pieces that fit. Two pieces. Aha, okay, I get that. That's how it fits. And literally for the last 40 plus years, I've been picking up pieces and looking at, okay, that's how that fits, that's how that fits. I started studying law almost 20 years ago. When I started studying law, it started galvanizing and beginning to frame out and integrate. And we're going to talk a lot about law and money. Because how I define it is history is the study of the progression of the development of what we call law in order to ultimately arrive at the phase we're in now to create a global money system and utilize that money system to entrain and control the human population and use that human population to harvest the real wealth of the planet, the resources, and the labor to put those resources into structure and work in order for the human population to build its own prison and separate out different categories of the human population. You can be prison wardens, you can be guards, you have to be prisoners, you have to be, do the dirty work, etc., etc. But history is the flow of creating the matrix, which is basically law and money, which are the flip sides of the same coin in essence, and outpicturing a system in which the entrainment of the population and the resources and the wealth could be structured, as we all know, to what we have today, what Alex Jones coined as the prison planet. So back to Michael Tazarian, he discusses the fall of Atlantis per se. It's not necessarily talking about the rising of the oceans from the melting of the ice as I do, but basically that at the end of that era, the British Isles became the repository of a lot of the knowledge of what has then disseminated over the last 10, 12,000 years into what we have today. It was, from his point of view, and it seems accurate for me, a relatively benevolent society seeking to rebuild civilization. But when we get into history a little bit shortly, what comes into play is some sort of insertion of a counter force, a parasitic insertion that took that knowledge and basically turned it inside out and upside back around to use it as a mechanism of control. Jordan Maxwell talks about something called the ILI, I-L-L-I, or I-L-I. Anybody familiar with that term? Are you? Yes. You've been hanging with Jordan, you should. Yes. Okay. I-L-I. These were the elevated ones, the ones who were up upon, if we add an L, if we, the ILI. You know, there are many letters in our alphabet that became the article, TH, or sometimes D, or D is more like of.
Does this dovetail into civilization?
Yeah, okay, all of that. Nobility.
And Roman law.
Yeah, well, we're going to get into all of that. Okay. Like in San Francisco, there's something called Nob Hill, which is the highest point in that little peninsula of San Francisco. Nob is the high point, okay? Basically, Nob Hill is where the, the aristocracy hang out. So the ILI were small elite families who basically hanging out up on the hill that later in the last 1,000 years became the castles, the lord and the manor of the hill, etc. Where did the castle always go? On the top of the hill. The people were down below serving the ILI, okay? The elite, the nobility, okay? So in the British Isles, they had a couple of key focuses for their spiritual relationship. And there were several goddesses' names. Ire, Eri. Ire is where we get Ireland. We're going to come around and notice this word, this name, frequently. The ILI were the ones who were at the top, who controlled it all, directed it. The Ari were the wise men, the educated, the druids, the priesthood, holding the scientific knowledge, and created, actually, according to Michael Tazarian's work, colleges, and disseminated that knowledge throughout this whole area. Europe, what we call Europe. They were also known as the Iberu. What we call Spain now used to be called Iberia. Okay. This area used to be Siberia, or still is Siberia. Well, and this area is still Iberia, Hibernia, you know, H, the Hiberu. Okay, sound like a familiar phonetic sound? We were just talking earlier, Barbara and I, about she studied language and linguistics in her life. That was an interest, a very strong interest of mine, as the other thing that I got into, focused in my life at an early age, was I wanted to be a writer. Eventually that became more like I want to be a communicator. I want to disseminate the knowledge and the information, the understanding that I developed over time. But I've always had a love of language. I've been a poet in one form or another my whole life. And so I studied language and linguistics in university for a few years. As I got into all of this, especially when I started studying law, law is very exact in terms of words, definitions, the construction and use of language, or the misconstruction and the manipulation of words and language. So we're going to get into the nuances of how language, we're very fixed in our mind now in terms of what something is. You know, a word means this, but we have no clue where the origins of that word really come from. You know, in terms of Egyptian words, Sumerian, Babylonian, even before that period, Sanskrit, Dravidic language, which came from here, Sanskrit and Dravidic language. But, you know, san is where we get our word saint, sacred. This meant sacred. Skrit is where we get our word scribe, okay, to write. This is Sanskrit means sacred language. Now, the actual fact in terms of Sanskrit is that there were 47 sound tones that made up the Sanskrit language that were actually located in the body. So that's why they consider it a sacred language, because it came out of the human body. And it's mapped in the human body. As a little side note. Yeah. So back to the Iberu and the Ari. The Ari were the wise men, the educated, the scientists, the priests, etc. And they disseminated out this way, long before the Judeo-Christian, which was really Egyptian, Sumerian, Babylonian, co-opted it, turned it upside down and inside out, and said they were the source and the origin, and established that basis to justify their taking the place of the Ili and the Ari. Okay. If you look at the Indus Valley, which is over here, the Ganges River, the beginning 2,000, 2,500 years ago or thereabouts of what became the modern civilization there, I think it goes further back than that in terms of time, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years, were known as the Aryans, okay? Or what we would call the Aryans, okay? Now you look at modern time, Hitler and the Nazis, they were the Aryan race, right? Okay, well, when it started, the Aryans, or the Ari, were truly the educated wise men who were disseminating the knowledge and the science and attempting to raise mankind back to a level of education and civilization, for lack of a better word. But that parasitic turnover then inserted itself about 5,000, 6,000 years ago. Is that when it started? No. This thing started billions of years ago, okay? This is just the time frame that we have a cognizance of, okay? But in my estimation, we've been dealing with this for a long, long time. You know, we just go through the cycles and the time loops and the repetition, you know. Nietzsche coined a phrase called the eternal recurrence. For anybody who read Nietzsche in college, I did a lot. You know, you probably read it in in German. Okay. Did you read Nietzsche?
Nietzsche, oh yes.
Yeah. And you remember the eternal recurrence.
Yes.
You know, that we are always recurring or returning back to where we started, which is the case. We are stuck in time. We keep on looping and looping. We keep recreating it. You know, whether that's a time cycle of the last 1,000 years, 2,000 years, whatever. You know, we're right here in the Roman Empire. You know, the police and the, you know, Homeland Security, they're just Roman centurions, you know, recycled. We need some more centurions. Let's bring them in and insert them and remind them of who they are and who they've been pre-programmed to be. You know, we just keep doing this over and over again. Okay.
The Augustan era springs to mind. You know, totalitarianism.
Sure. So.
Before you pick up